good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our today's webinar. Today we have Debbie Deal with us, who is from the CCAP. Real quick, before we start our webinar today, just a couple of housekeeping items. First off, all attendees are in listen-only mode. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the question box, which you'll find on the right side of your screen. And then there's also a handout there for you to download, which is a PDF of the PowerPoint you're going to see today. So with that, I'm just going to turn over the presentation to Debbie, and we'll get it started.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I hit share my screen, and so now I'm going to try to bring up the PowerPoint. Let's see what we can do here. Can you see that?
Sure can.
All right. Okay, so we're going to start a PowerPoint presentation, and then we're going to be walking through some good information today, some information that is relevant, some information that is relatively new from the FCMAT team. I want to share some future things with you. So with that, we're going to get going here. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate you joining us. As you know, with everything that's happened in the last few weeks with COVID, our world has changed dramatically with finance, with program, with operations, and every day it seems like our information is changing and updating. So we're bringing you today the latest information that we have, and I'll be happy to answer some questions along the way. So with that, we're going to get going. So here I am the ex-retiree, if you will, and not a very good one, I guess, of FCMAT. I joined FCMAT in 2007, and for 1 year in there, I was a CBO and came back. And then I retired December a year ago. And before that, I was a CBO in school districts. I was a coordinator of business services. I've had a long career in education, just about 30 years, and just can't stay away from it. So anyway, now I do some training. We also help authorizers with charter schools. So I'm in a lot of different spaces right now. I'm just happy to be here today to share with you. We're going to do some updates. We're going to learn about a few new things. We're going to provide you some support and a lot of resources. So for today, just some takeaways, fiscal information as we know it, some updates that I have for you. How do we go about wrapping up our 2019-20 school year? It's been a wild one since the last probably 8 weeks or so. Now we're into it since we first started hearing some serious news about COVID. I want to talk with you, especially small school districts, about building up cash reserves in general, but mostly cash. And we're going to really get into that a little bit later on. And how do we all brace for 2020, 2021, and beyond in our multi-year projections? And how do we help those that we are authorizing charter schools? How do we help our charter schools also brace for that multi-year financial projection and what's going to be required for us to stay afloat? I'm going to really press on cash management. This is going to be a key. 2 keys that you're going to need going forward are going to be building up your reserves and your fund balance, but making sure that a significant part of those reserves is made up of cash. And those that are going to go through this and come out the other end stronger without having to make deep cuts are those districts and charter schools that do cash management, that start now as soon as possible building up those reserves. So we're gonna be talking about some different elements that can help you do that. All of these things are overlapping. We have programs that are being disrupted, distance learning, to which all of you superintendents and CBOs are aware of out there. A lot of technology and different things. Everybody's trying so hard to reach the kids. We have operations. How are we dealing with operations? How are we dealing with getting technology out to kids, to families, helping teachers? all of a sudden our world is just really turned upside down, and there's so many things that I'm so proud to see in the field, people reacting in such a positive way to make sure that things have happened extremely fast in getting distance learning out, getting equipment out, technology lined up, companies helping us with those connections, and of course all the fiscal people trying to make sense of it all. Everybody looking to the fiscal people, what's going on, what's going to happen with our current year, what's going to happen with our next year. So there's so many things that are going on, and yet here we are working at home, distance learning, trying to take care of all of these matters and trying to understand how we are going to project in our multi-year financial projections. So there are lots and lots of challenges. So today I wanted to bring to you the executive orders of the governor. First, of course, we had the N2620. That was the first one that came out. And then just yesterday, you can see that there have been 4. And each one have different provisions. So it's kind of like passing a new law. But then what happens is that there's trailer bills that come along. And so that's exactly what's happening. And so we just keep watching and waiting for, you know, the next thing that's going to happen. So the first thing that happened was we needed to make sure when schools closed that we provided meals for the children, and we started getting some supports out there for these opportunities for distance learning. We were gathering up equipment, we were pushing all of that out, and we were trying to pay all of our employees and sort it all out. Then there were some questions that came along about, you know, what are we going to do about the Brown Act, and how are we going to react to this when people are social distancing and so on and so forth. And then there's more. What about state assessments, and how are we going to do testing? So another executive order. And now as we approach the very end of the fiscal year and get into May revise, we start struggling with how are we going to present the budget and alignment with LCAP. And so now executive order has come out, which will extend and push out some of these LCAP provisions. We're going to have a little bit more information for you later in this presentation. But first, I think it's really important to kind of take a look back and really have a good understanding of how our state budget is built, which state budgets are built differently. Some state budgets are built heavily on county property taxes, like in Maryland. Half of what goes to support schools comes from the county, not from the state. But in the state of California, things are very different here. And we've learned that through these different cycles of budget downturns, is that our state budget is built on 3 primary taxes, and here they are. The first one is the personal income tax, and that makes up about 2/3 of the state budget. So when you think about school districts in K-14, in our K-12 environment, we own about 40% of that state budget. So when 2/3 of that budget is made up of personal income tax, and when you think about that connection with all of the soaring unemployment, people not paying into personal income tax, people being laid off, then we know that those taxes are down. When we see the stock market going down, and we know that corporate taxes are hooked to that stock market and capital gains, that's the next biggest part of our state budget. And then lastly, when we look at sales tax, of course, with everybody being home, nobody's out shopping, nobody's going to the movies, we're not going to the restaurants, we're not going on cruises, we're not flying in airplanes. So we're buying necessities, and Amazon, bless their heart, can't keep up with everything right now. But we know that the sales taxes are down as well. So when our state budget is built on these 3 tax models, and all 3 models are dropping at the same time, this is a very extraordinary time, a very extraordinary event, and it's happened so rapidly. So we really put caution out there at this point that when you really put this in context and we think about okay, we're going to lose just about a third to a half of a year of our state economy by the time we roll out of this and start getting back to something called normal. And it's going to take a while. So when all three of these tax pieces that make up our state budget drop, then we know we're going to have to be dealing with some very significant issues relative to our state budget. And of course, that's going to roll down to our K-12, K-14 budgets. And so we're in for a bumpy ride. This is coming on very quickly. It's not coming down slowly or coming down rapidly at first and then little bumps along the way. Instead, what we see is a very fast turn, very quick. We expect that recovery to take a bit of time, but the impact is going to be extremely strong and it's going to hit us very, very quickly. I didn't want everybody to forget about the CDE waivers. There's lots of waivers that are going to happen right now. And of course, the first thing that happened to us that I recall is that the P2 dates moved up from on or before April 15th, which is our normal cutoff for P2, to February 29th. And so then that occurred, and there will be a waiver that's going to be required for school districts and charter schools to apply for. The last I looked a couple of days ago, that waiver was still not available. But there's several other waivers out there, and so these links here in your materials will take you into the CDE section at COVID-19. And if those links aren't working, you can still find it. Just go to CDE. They've got a whole section just for COVID-19. And there's some flexibility waivers. There's lots of good information there. There's some slide decks that you can go through. But don't forget to have your staffs file for those waivers that will be required for some of the federal issues and also for attendance. So here we are, almost at May revise. And this is the time of the year where we're actually in the thrust of building our budgets for next year and our multi-year financial projections. And yet, what's been pushed out? But our April 15th tax deadline has been pushed out to July. And now our LCAP deadlines have been pushed out to later in the year. So we will have a little bit of disconnect between our budget and our LCAP. And because of all of the uncertainty that is happening right now in our industry in this space, then we fully expect that May revise is just the best guess that the state's going to be able to come out with. We fully expect that in August, there will be another round of updates from the state. We will have more information about personal income taxes by then, what's coming in July. And then probably even later in the year, there will be another major update about how these economic downturns and conditions have impacted the state budget. It's way too early at this time to really assess that information. And by the way, the state doesn't have all of those pieces just yet. So here are some things to start thinking about. And I want to start over with COLA, and I'm going to be giving you some information from FCMAT's fiscal alert about COLA. Right now, just even looking back a couple of weeks ago, we know that we have statutory COLA, which ends and is set on a 12-month period prior to March, the end of March. And that COLA is already set, and the number is positive. It's 2.31%, a little bit up actually from January's estimate of 2.29, but that will not be realized. So while we have a positive number, this is going to be something that's going to be a little confusing to explain to folks as we start talking to our constituents, as we start talking to our union leadership and others and our boards and our folks that come to our board meetings. It's going to be a little hard to explain that, yes, the calculated COLA is a positive number, 2.31%. But a little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to share with you that FCMAT is suggesting at this point that it's at least a minus 2%, what is actually going to be realized as we enter into the next fiscal year. So we need to start doing some serious planning around that, because that is a significant drop in funding. We have also seen in the last quarter about a 15% drop in state lottery funding. People are not going out buying ticket sales are down. We also think and look at the horizon about deficits and deferrals. We wonder about what's going to happen with ADA and enrollment, especially with distance learning. How are we going to come back next year after COVID is over? How are we going to bring kids back and families back into our schools? Will there be a combination of learning types that happen, regular traditional classrooms, maybe coupled up with televised distance learning opportunities into that same classroom? What about independent study? What about non-classroom based program? Especially for charters with the new laws and the moratoriums, that's going to be an interesting discussion. What kinds of additional reductions might be happening? What about mid-year cuts? We got into that before. And certainly cash management is going to be a very key component. Now, for the past 5 years, we really haven't had a cash issue. We've been getting our LCFF funding, and for the most part, we've been getting that backfill of LCFF funding until full funding did occur. And so we were getting our apportionment schedules on time. We were getting our 5% apportionment in July and a 5% in August and 9% in all other months. For those that are on that schedule, most districts are. So cash really hasn't been that much of a problem for the last 5 years. But before that, and some of us that have been in education for a while, remember the days of the Great Recession when in 8, 9, 9, 10 primarily and on, that we had significant cash issues where the state was deficiting the revenue limits or deficiting the LCFF. And then we had deferrals where it's like, I owe you this much money in August, but part of that I can't pay you until next February, and so on. And you'll remember the money bags there. At one point in the height of it, there were 13 of them, and they were actually crossing fiscal years. So that was really challenging. And then as cash improved because the deficit started disappearing and things started improving, the economy was improving, we kind of got away from that monthly cash flow exercise. But I encourage you, especially small districts, extremely important to start getting back into the mode of doing your cash management every single month, and certainly building up those reserves to brace ourselves for these deficits and deferrals that are no doubt coming. We already know that the June apportionment, for example, will probably be the first one that we will be paid in July. Yet we still need to make June payrolls. So these are the kinds of significant events that get small school districts and charter schools in a lot of financial trouble. So these are some things to think about as we move ahead. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but as we get this latest governor's executive order, these are some of the things that are in there, and you'll have that in your materials. And I'm sure there'll be more to come. So as we start wrapping up 1920, we know that there is some CARES Act money. This is federal money. There was $30.5 billion that was appropriated by the Congress. And it was actually calculated and distributed based on Title I allocations, a percentage of Title I allocations to each one of the states. And California got a significant amount of that money. and based on those dollars, then the state of California will then appropriate that money down to school districts and also to charter schools. In fact, School Services of California has a little estimate on their website. You can put your school name in there. It'll come up with the estimate of what they believe that you will get and that you will earn. And roughly they're saying that it's about 80% of the current year Title I allocation. So this is an amount of money. This is a plus. This is one-time money, but certainly can go towards your technology needs, certainly can go towards building up your cash reserves. Perhaps if you have a 3% reserve level requirement or a 4 or 5% reserve level requirement, now is the time to carefully consider using some of that money to build up your cash reserves to a higher level and maybe get a board resolution around that. The other part of new funding, one-time funding again, is Senate Bill 117 quickly came out from our state legislature, and that was $17 and change per P1 ADA. Those monies were distributed pretty quickly with the intent of backfilling schools with money to help with the COVID response, of folks cleaning the classrooms, cleaning the campuses and the district offices, buying those supplies, disinfectants, all of those reactionary costs that we were incurring at the beginning of the school closure. So those two pieces of revenue need to be booked into the 1920 year. Even if the CARES Act money doesn't come before the end of June, it will be booked into the current year and then can be carried over. Certainly, we are realizing a little bit of savings in this fiscal year. Substitute costs, for example, some school districts are realizing some savings in transportation costs. We're not running, all of our schools are not open right now, so we're having some utility savings with overtime, extra time not occurring, and MPA services as opposed to MPS services. Interventions into the classroom, those kinds of outside services and consultant type services are not being done at this time. So we might be able to gather up a little bit of savings from the 1920 fiscal year. Again, some thoughts to build up those reserve levels to brace yourself for what's to come. We also know that we have some unusual costs that we wouldn't normally have, and I previously spoke about those, maybe extra overtime and extra time for the M&O crews. Maybe some impacts from food service workers having to work more time in remote locations. There are some hazard pay items in contracts out there right now. And so those are additional costs, of course, the cleaning. But what's most important about this is building up, again, the cash reserves and the reserves in your fund balance. And I'll probably say that a few more times. It'll be so boring by the end of this presentation, but I couldn't say it enough, because that is really going to be the key to managing how you are able to react to what's going to happen next in 2020, 2021, and beyond. I was originally saying in this presentation up until just this weekend, plan for a zero COLA in those outside years and run multiple scenarios if you like. But now I'm starting to hear about negative COLA, and I haven't heard that in a very long time. But definitely run different scenarios, have your business office run different multi-year scenarios with zero COLA, with a negative COLA of 1%, of 2%. Now, FCMAT is believing at this point in time, given all of the information known to date, that planning for a minus 2% COLA would be where they're comfortable. They also put in their letter that it could be as deep as a minus 10% COLA. Now, I've never seen that, and I don't think anybody that I know has, but it certainly isn't out of the realm of possibility at this point, given what we've seen. So certainly cash is king and credit is better. And I say cash is king for school districts because school districts, if they run out of cash, they can get a state loan. But for charter schools, credit is better, because if they run out of cash, they go out of business unless they have credit. And so they could go out and get one of the factor their receivables, I call them the payday loans. But if they have credit availability, if they have good credit, then they can do some borrowing and they can stay in business. Now, if we look back in history, and not that long ago, into the Great Recession, we found that the state utilizes mechanisms of deficits and deferrals and mid-year cuts to solve their own cash flow problems. We fully expect that the state will engage in that same activity again. So again, I go back to the little cash bags, going across months and going across fiscal year. And we fully expect that that will happen again. Like I said, at one point we had 13 of those money bags traveling, all around into the different months and crossing the fiscal year. We don't know how bad this is going to get, but we do know that it will be of significant concern. The good news is that as we go into this downturn and kind of off the cliff, if you will, we at least have a good position at the state going into this. So in January, the estimates from the governor's office was that with the rainy day funds available in the state's fund balance, we had somewhere around $20.5 billion. But then when COVID-19 hit, then the governor had approval for $1 billion, and it didn't take too long before the governor signaled that he'd need at least $6 billion to help with the COVID response around the state of California. That is one-time money, just like it is in our fund balance. When we have fund balance, that is one-time money. And so there is still some money left, and that will help soften that blow for all of the state agencies, including schools, as we go into this. So it is a different scenario than what we had before. Before we went into a Great Recession, we did not have significant reserves at the state level, and we took significant hits. What's different now is that we're not going into it gradually at all. We're going into it full on, and so that will take that money off the top first, and then we'll see how the state revenues come in after the July taxes, and into the summer. Probably our first realistic look will be in August. So I really stress this part, especially for you folks, because with small school districts, it's even more difficult to manage through these events of economic downturns, because there's limited places where you can go to make those cuts. So anything that you can do now, and I remember Joel Montero always said, cutting $1 today is $3 in a multi-year financial projection. So the sooner that you can do it, make cuts or save and build up fund reserves, the better off you are going to be able to weather this storm. And we believe that that is going to be a tremendous one. So for small school districts, it is a real important thing for you to increase the cash portion of your ending fund balance. And then once again, managing cash flow on a monthly basis, a critical activity that should start right now. We should pull out those spreadsheets and blow off the dust and get those things going. And FCMAT always did recommend, we always recommended that the districts and charter schools, by the way, would have at least 1 year and 1 more year. So 2 years of cash flow, the current and 1 more year out there in terms of maintaining fiscal solvency. So for those of you that authorize charter schools, I put in a little slide here trying to help our charter schools navigate through this same thing. Many of these same principles that I'm speaking today also are applicable to the charter schools. So we need to have a unified message to them. We need to also remind them of their waivers and timelines, and share with them the same information about the economic downturn so that they can react. Unlike school districts, they don't have a hold harmless. They live and breathe on their current year ADA, enrollment ADA numbers. They don't get the better of last year or this year. And we think that next year will probably be less just on the natural. And when we already have more than 50% of the school districts in the state declining enrollment, this double whammy of, having a declining enrollment at the same time that we're having an economic downturn is very difficult to manage. But for charter schools, it's even worse because one, they can't get a state loan, and two, they have no hold harmless provisions. So they will live and breathe on next year's P2 numbers. So we need to help them and get this information out so they can start also reacting to this in the same way. Provide training to the charters on cash flow management. Share with them some of the tools that we have access to in our business offices, and build good communication between the authorizers and the charter schools, providing some flexibility, because we're getting some flexibility from the state. We also need to be aware that charters need to react to some of these things too. And kind of what I'm having in mind here is that we may have a classroom-based program, a charter petition that is built on a classroom-based program. But what if they need to get into distance learning for next year, just like we do as school districts? Is that distance learning going to be considered non-classroom based instruction, or is it going to be considered live classroom instruction? What about independent study? Is this going to become a material revision or not? These are some of the things that you're going to struggle with as authorizers for charter schools, some things to think about. So as we look into the future, and I'm not talking about in 2 years or 3 years, I'm just looking at the immediate future, about summertime, about just getting to December, major uncertainty about what's happening in our space right now. When will our state and parts of our state be able to go back to work? When will our kids really be able to come back to school? And when are parents going to feel comfortable there? How is that going to impact our ADA? How is that going to impact how we do distance learning? How will all of this have an impact on our budget as we try to navigate through these unknown areas and prepare ourselves and be fiscally solvent and fiscally responsible? Some of what I'm hearing in the state from the Legislative Analyst's Office, from FCMAT, from others, from school services, build a baseline budget and prepare multiple models. This is going to be a key for you to get through this too, with different assumptions. It may be a 0 COLA, a -1 COLA, a -2 COLA. What does that look like, and what will you have to do to survive that? How can you start saving now for that to make you whole and fiscally solvent at the end of the day? We're always working in a 3-year model, so whatever impacts that you have in the projection year, I will call it 2020, 2021, will also have an impact in year 2 and year 3, and we always have to be looking at that 3-year scenario. So those different models will help you navigate. And one of the things a superintendent of mine did years and years ago, back in 2002, 2003, was my first experience of a budget downturn. And as we were starting to go into the budget downturn and we were getting signals much like I'm giving you today, my superintendent pulled together the cabinet and directors and said, we're going to start having some conversations about bundling, making $250,000 bundles of cuts. And if such and such happens, bundle number 1 is going to get pulled. We're going to pull that trigger. If such and such happens, bundle number 2 is going to get pulled. It's going to get triggered, and so on. We had 3 bundles of $250,000 each at the time. We did actually execute bundle 1 and bundle 2, by the way. But this was done in advance. It was done with the team. It was done with stakeholders. It was shared with the board. Part of the stakeholder group was the union leadership. So when these events did happen, there was no surprise. There was no scrambling around. What do we cut? There were no sacred cows. Everybody knew exactly what was going to happen if XYZ happened. And XYZ was like maybe a mid-year cut, or it, was less than the funding that we were expecting in every single case. And all of those were based around the classroom, keeping the cuts as far away from the classroom as possible. So bundle number 1 had absolutely no impact to what happened directly into the classroom. But by the time you got down to level 2 and level 3, we were starting to get into deeper and deeper cuts, where it was more and more difficult. But that approach I never forgot, because it made sense to me that you plan in advance. You included lots of people. There was good communication. It was just pretty mechanical when it happened, and there wasn't a whole lot of upset going on. We would love to avoid all budget cuts, and we can avoid some of this in as much as possible if we start reacting now. So I encourage you to run through these different budget assumption models and maybe think about having a phased approach into budget adjustments, if you will. There's a little known, but a new provision in the 1920 Budget Act just this year. Of course, our economy was going very, very well, and there was no real reason to really focus on this until now. But there's a new provision called the K-12 auto fit provision, which will most likely be implemented, by the way. And what this does is it allows the Department of Finance, the director of the Department of Finance, to auto fit, if you will, the LCFF COLA calculation to fit within the minimum guarantee. So essentially what can happen is that the director, the Department of Finance, can reduce COLA to 0. We fully expect that it will go a little bit deeper than that, but this is a new provision, and wouldn't you know, it was just enacted in the state budget this year, and it will probably be triggered in its very first year. So again, cash flow management, building those reserves just as quickly as possible. In the CCAP library, we have lots of resources. We have links, we have articles, we have slide decks, and I think a lot of folks around the state, a lot of organizations are really trying to do a really good job in this space, trying to put a lot of information together in a very common area. We encourage you to take a look there and see what we have. And in case you missed it, in April, at the end of April, I did a full cash flow training, a whole slide deck webinar presentation of cash flow management. That also came with a second part, and that was blew off the dust of the spreadsheet and presented actually a 2-year cash flow model. And those materials are up on our website free of charge. The first one has some numbers in it so you can see how it worked. The second one has formulas where you can plug in your own numbers, and it actually creates a 2-year cash flow model. Certainly, if you had any questions, I put my my 2 emails up here, and you can feel free to contact me at any point. But before we go into questions and answers, I want to point you to FCMAT's website. And up in publications and reports, there's a new fiscal alert. And it talks about many of the things that I spoke about today. As we start building our budget scenarios for next year, reserve levels, it talks about what the projection of the FCMAT team is looking at this point with, they believe, quote unquote, the best case funded COLA could be in the -2 range, the worst case in the -10 range, depending on a multitude of considerations, and they list those. So the reality is that we are into uncharted territory. While we've had budget cycles before that have been cyclic and we've come out of them, this is very, very different. And so, you know, I wish everybody the best of luck as we go through it. We will probably have a series of webinars as we keep up with these activities, as we get more information on May revise, as we get more information after personal income taxes are known. And we hope to share that with you. So with that, I'm going to look at and see if we have any questions that I need. So Corey, if you're on the line, did I miss anybody's questions at this time? And maybe this is time to open that up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we do not have any questions just now, but as I mentioned before when we started the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the question box located on the right side of the screen, and I will field those over to Debbie. As we wait, Debbie, is there anything else you want to add to kind of wrap up your presentation?
No, I think I've really pressed a lot on cash flow management and building up the reserves, and I honestly think that that's our best weapon at this point against what's going to happen in the future, if you will. So I just encourage the small school districts especially to pay attention to that and to get on board with cash flow management. And I thank you for the opportunity to visit with everybody today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for such a great and informational webinar. I think you did such a good job. Nobody's got a question right now.
Well, either that or they're scared to death. I don't know. Yeah.
Or they just have a lot of information to digest. Well, what we can do is, I know Debbie included her email address at the end of the presentation. And as I'd mentioned, there is a PDF download of that PowerPoint available in the handouts. And I'll be sending out a recording of this along with the handouts probably tomorrow after it is processed. So you can always revisit this again. And if you have trouble getting a hold of Debbie, feel free to email me at corrie@ssda.org, and I'd be happy to forward any questions you have to Debbie.
Okay, then that's it for today. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who signed in today. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.